Assalamu alaikum, welcome to Islamic Economics series. We spend a lot of time looking at the Muslim world through the lens of politics and economics, right? But what if we've been looking at this all wrong? What if the biggest challenges we see today are actually just symptoms of a much, much deeper problem? Something rooted in our very way of thinking. Well, today we're going to dive into a really profound diagnosis of that very issue.
You see the headlines every day: conflict, instability, economic trouble. But what if we're all just chasing symptoms? The analysis we're exploring today makes a powerful argument that we are. And it all begins with this incredibly stark assessment right here on the screen. The Ummah of Islam stands at present at the lowest rung of the ladder of nations. I mean, that's a tough pill to swallow, for sure. But figuring out why that statement was made is absolutely crucial.
Now, that's not just some random, pessimistic opinion. It's actually the starting point for a critical diagnosis pioneered by incredible thinkers, like the late Dr. Ismail Raji al-Faruqi. See, he and his colleagues argued that, to fix the Ummah's problems, we can't just slap a Band-Aid on the symptoms. We have to be more like a doctor. We have to find the actual root cause of the disease, what they famously called the Ummah's malaise, which is just this deep-seated, persistent state of weakness. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. We're going to follow that same diagnostic path. First, we'll talk about what this malaise really is. Then we'll look at the obvious, visible symptoms. And from there, we'll start peeling back the layers to find what this analysis says is the real core of the crisis: a broken educational system that has led to a major intellectual decline. So, let's get right into it. What exactly is this malaise? Well, you can think of it as a painful paradox. On one hand, you've got a global community, over 1 billion strong, sitting on some of the world's most valuable natural resources. But on the other hand, a long history of colonization, exploitation, and frankly, humiliation on the world stage. It's that huge, jarring gap between the incredible potential of the Ummah and its current reality. That is the malaise. Okay, so that's the general feeling, the condition. But how does this weakness actually show up in the real world? What can we see and touch? Well, the analysis breaks the symptoms down into 3 big interconnected areas: the political, the economic, and the cultural. First up, let's talk politics. The main symptom here is just fragmentation. Things are broken apart. The source talks about post-colonial borders that were almost designed to create endless friction between nations. And then, internally, within those nations, you often have deep divisions and a lack of strong, stable political institutions. And what happens when there's a vacuum? Well, it gets filled, either by westernized elites, who are often totally disconnected from their own people, or by the military. And, of course, that political weakness bleeds directly into the economy. The symptoms here are backwardness and dependency. I mean, think about it. Nations with immense wealth that can't even provide their own people with basic necessities, like food or essential technology. The source is really clear on this. This wasn't some accident. It argues that colonial powers systematically dismantled local industries to make these regions dependent markets for their own goods. And then there's the cultural decline, which is maybe the most painful symptom of all. It shows up as a kind of shattered sense of self. The very integrity of Islamic culture gets fractured. And this creates a really deep confusion, where you see people adopting the most superficial parts of Western culture, while at the same time losing touch with the incredible depth of their own heritage. The authors use an unbelievably powerful phrase to describe this state of being. You can see it right there. The end result is a person who has made of himself something neither Islamic nor Western, a cultural freak of modern times. I mean, what a provocative image. It perfectly captures that deep identity crisis of being caught between 2 worlds and not really belonging to either one. Okay, so let's recap. We've got political division, economic dependency, and cultural confusion. Seems pretty clear what needs to be fixed, right? Well, this is exactly where the analysis takes a sharp turn. The book asks us to stop and think. Are these the actual diseases we need to cure, or are they just the fever, the cough, the visible signs of a much deeper, hidden sickness? And this question brings us right to the heart of the diagnosis. Because, it argues, if we only focus on treating these symptoms, we're never, ever going to achieve a real revival. We first have to correctly identify and then confront the true root cause of the Ummah's weakness. And here it is. This is the core argument. The problem isn't external, it's internal. It is a crisis in the way Muslims think. Let me say that again. All the political failures, the economic stagnation, the cultural confusion, these are not the disease. They are the symptoms of a much deeper intellectual breakdown, a malaise of thought. So the next logical question is, if the problem is in how we think, where did our thinking go so wrong? The source points its finger directly at one place, the educational system. And it uses this powerful metaphor, calling it the laboratory, where this crisis is cooked up and then passed down, generation after generation. The huge, fundamental flaw that's identified is what's called bifurcation, basically a split in education. It broke into completely opposite systems. So on one side, you have the traditional Islamic system, which the text argues too often became stagnant and disconnected from the real challenges of the modern world. And on the other side, you have the secular system, mostly a colonial import, which is described as a poor copy of the West that actively disconnects students from their own Islamic roots. This quote just drives the point home so powerfully. Education is never a neutral thing. It is literally the laboratory where consciousness is molded. And what's the final product of this broken system? It isn't a confident, modern, authentic Muslim. It's a caricature, a distorted imitation that isn't truly Islamic, but isn't successfully Western either. So, you've got this flawed educational foundation. What does that lead to? Well, it leads directly to a decline in our intellectual and methodological tools. It's a breakdown in the actual process of how our ideas are supposed to connect to the real world and, change things for the better. The source points out a few key breakdowns. First, the abandonment of ijtihad, which is our vital tradition of creative, independent reasoning to solve new problems. That led to stagnation. Then, a false wall was built up between revelation and reason, as if our faith and our intellect were enemies. Thought became just an academic exercise, disconnected from real-world action, and life itself got split into two boxes, religious stuff over here and world stuff over there, a dualism totally foreign to Islam's holistic view of life. And the final, tragic result of this whole chain reaction? It's a deep estrangement from our own Islamic legacy. Instead of seeing our tradition as this vibrant, living source of creativity to solve today's problems, it gets treated like a historical fossil. Something you put behind glass in a museum to admire from a distance, but not something you actually use to build the future. And according to this analysis, that right there is the ultimate intellectual tragedy and the true core of the Malaise. So, this entire diagnosis forces us to ask a final, absolutely critical question. Because if all the political chaos and economic problems are really just symptoms of a disease of the mind, then that changes everything. It means true revival can't start in a parliament or on a battlefield. It has to start somewhere else entirely. And that leaves us with this challenge. If the crisis is truly one of thought, where must the work of revival begin? See you in the next one. Subscribe, like, and comment.